The Clockmaker's Secret. In the heart of an old European village where cobblestone streets twisted like forgotten tales, there stood a tiny clock shop that few dared to enter. Its windows were dusty, its wooden sign worn down by years of rain and wind. But the real reason people avoided it was the man inside, an aging clockmaker named Herr Greaves, known for his cold blue eyes and hands that always smelled faintly of oil and metal. Legend had it that every clock Herr Greaves built kept perfect time. So perfect, in fact, that people whispered he'd made a deal with time itself. Some believed he was cursed. Others thought he was a genius who had simply wandered too far into his craft. Regardless, his clocks ticked with a rhythm that felt alive. One evening, a young orphan named Ilara slipped inside the shop. She was small enough to go unnoticed, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She had heard the stories, but more importantly, she'd heard the ticking. It was constant, like the heartbeat of something ancient. She wanted to see it for herself. Inside, the shop was a labyrinth of gears, cogs, and pendulums. The air was thick with the smell of metal shavings and varnish. At the center of the room stood the grandest clock Ilara had ever seen. Taller than her, its golden hands moving with a deliberate grace. Herr Greaves sat hunched beside it, whispering to the clock under his breath. "Who are you speaking to?" Ilara asked, her voice small but steady. The old man turned sharply, his blue eyes piercing into hers. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his voice held no anger. "What makes your clock so perfect?" she asked, taking a cautious step forward. Herr Greaves sighed, his bony fingers rubbing his forehead. After a moment of silence, he beckoned her closer. "Time is alive, child," he whispered. "It speaks, but few can hear it. I learned to listen." Ilara's brow furrowed. "What does time say?" "It bargains," he replied, his voice quivering. "For every clock I make, it gives me a little more time. But the price is my memories." Ilara's eyes widened. She looked around the room at the countless clocks ticking in unison, their faces staring back at her like unblinking eyes. "Why would you do that?" she asked softly. "Because I feared death more than I loved life," Herr Greaves said, his voice breaking. "But now I don't even remember the faces of those I loved. I have time, but I've lost everything else." For the first time, Ilara noticed the sadness in his eyes, a deep, hollow loneliness that no amount of time could fill. "What if you stop?" she asked. He looked at her, his gaze lingering as though trying to remember something long lost. "Then the clocks will stop too. And time," he pointed to the grand clock behind him, "time will take back what it's owed." Ilara thought for a moment before taking a bold step forward. "Then maybe it's time you let it go." Herr Greaves stared at her, the gears in his mind turning as steadily as the ones surrounding him. Then with trembling hands, he reached up and pulled the pendulum of the grand clock to a stop. The shop fell silent. The ticking ceased. For the first time in decades, the world seemed to exhale. Outside, the villagers reported something strange, an odd hush in the air, like the earth itself had paused for a single breath. Inside the shop, Herr Greaves smiled faintly as he sank into his chair, his eyes drifting closed. Ilara stepped back into the street, the silence of the shop still ringing in her ears. She looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would live fully, fearlessly, so time would never need to make a deal with her. And as the clockmaker's shop stood empty, the grand clock began to tick again, but this time it kept time for no one but itself. The end.